Welcome to Night Talks, the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications talk show, produced by students for you. I'm Mia Carrasco, a first-year student studying media production management and technology. And our guest today is John Woodrow Cox, a CJC alum who reported for the Tampa Bay Times as well as the Valley News in New Hampshire. He currently reports for the Washington Post. Hi, John. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. In 2008, you earned your bachelor's degree in journalism here at UF. What led you to pursue this field, and was there an aha moment that prompted you into journalism?
There was, and it had happened, in this building. I was taking Mike Foley's reporting class, which I had been reluctant to take because I'd heard all the stories everyone hears about Foley being really hard. And I had an advisor who encouraged me to take that class, and a few weeks into it, I really started to realize that this was meant for me. I had at least 2 majors before journalism, and so I really didn't know what I was going to do, what I wanted to do. I was a bit lost, and that class just, there was so much about it that was appealing, the impact you could have on the world, and I liked that it was competitive, and I liked that it was hard, and I had always liked writing a little bit, even though I was not good at it at all. That was really the beginning. In his class, I knew that I wanted to be a journalist.
And after graduating, you reported at the Valley News in New Hampshire. So how did you land this opportunity, and did you have a particular beat there?
Yeah, it was desperation. That's how I landed there. It was my only, the only opportunity that I had out of college. I graduated at the height of the recession in '08, and a lot of newsrooms were gutting their staffs. Hundreds, thousands of people in the industry were losing jobs that year. And so the editor of the Valley News had been a Pulitzer Prize winner at the St. Pete Times, and so I knew some folks there, and I went up for a tryout and wrote, I think, 3 stories for them, which was really nerve-wracking, and I got a job offer. And I had never envisioned working in New England as anything, certainly as a journalist, but as anything. But it was a great experience. I covered 3 small towns in Vermont, and I had to basically write a story every day. That's where I learned kind of the basics of breaking news reporting and how to work a beat, go to meetings, how to develop sources. It was a really, personally, it was a hard experience because it was very cold and I was a Florida boy, and that was challenging. But as a journalist, it was a really critical time in my career, and I'm certain that I would not have the job I have now if I didn't have that job.
Yeah, to be thrown into the mix so early on into your career that's a big deal, to be doing something every day, a story every day. And
I had, in college, I'd been very focused on long form and kind of longer stories. And one bit of advice is that, nobody really is going to hire you out of school to do those kinds of stories, right? You got to be able to do daily journalism. So I very much learned in real time how to do that. A lot of mistakes along the way.
Yeah, but that's how you learn. Yeah. In 2010, you earned your master's degree in management from UF. So what inspired you to get this degree?
So it was a few things. I thought eventually I might want to do something entrepreneurial in journalism. I thought it would be smart to have that degree. I also I thought I might want to teach one day, and I knew that a master's was helpful, if you want to teach. And then 2 or 3, it was really a backup plan. Journalism was in a state of real chaos, and I knew I couldn't make a career at the paper in New England. And thankfully, at the end of that experience, I got a job offer from the St. Pete Times. So I think within 2 weeks of leaving the master's program, I was a working journalist. So.
How did you get your foot in the door there, and how was that newsroom different from what you had experienced prior?
I had known the recruiter there. I had always dreamed of working for the St. Pete Times. That was always the goal. And I had stayed in touch with them, when I was up in New England, and the editor there, I think it sort of kept them up to date on the work that I was doing. And So they had recruited me a bit when I was in grad school to at least interview for some jobs, and so I did that, and I had interviewed for 3 jobs there, and I took a job at a bureau that unfortunately doesn't exist now in Hernando County, Florida, which is north of Tampa, St. Pete. It was a cops and courts job, which I always tell young print journalists that if you can get a job in that area, to do it early in your career, because it's a way to get on the front page. It's a way to get stories that people are going to read widely, and also, if you're somebody who's interested in narrative, there's built-in human drama in those stories. So it was a very different place. It was much larger. They had bureaus. They had more resources than the paper I worked at in New England, and but there was still that kind of daily expectation to get in the paper. I just tried to do a lot more enterprise.
So what were some of the most impactful stories you covered in the Tampa area?
Oh boy, I covered a lot of kind of classic Florida man stories.
Yeah.
I still remember a lot of really wild crime stories. I covered some hurricanes. Certainly, I kind of did all the classic Florida things. It was funny. One of the stories that got me hired at the Post, I was at a time I was a GA reporter, general assignment reporter in downtown St. Pete, and I would work a Saturday shift, which I didn't love. And I remember I got a call at like 5 a.m. on Saturday, and I was probably a little hungover, to be honest. And I got a call that said that a plane had crashed on a highway. And I can't remember exactly what town it was in, but a guy had been flying his daughter and her best friend down for spring break. They were in Chicago, and they flew down. He ran out of fuel before he reached the airport and tried to land on the highway and clipped a power line and nosedived, and he died and his daughter died. So I went out there, at 5 a.m. I found witnesses, and then I found that these 2 girls had been talking on social media. This was sort of a little bit early days of that being a new form of reporting, not to date myself too much, but they had both been anticipating this trip for weeks and were talking about it, on a public platform and on Instagram and on Twitter, and I built a lot of the story around that. So it was funny, like that ended up being a story that was in my clips package when I applied to the Post, and was a big part of, I think, why I got hired, which was not what I expected. It was a daily, but that was one of them.
That's interesting, though, yeah. In 2014, you then went on to work for the Washington Post as an enterprise reporter. What led you to getting this role, and what type of stories are you now focused on sharing?
I feel like a lot of good fortune helped me get that job. I had done a lot of networking there at the Post, so I knew people at the Post who were kind of on the inside and were helping me figure out what clips to submit and what to say in the interviews and what not to say in the interviews. But I worked really hard. I mean, to be an enterprise reporter at the Washington Post felt like a once in a lifetime chance. And I have been on that team for a decade. Much of my career there has been focused on how children are impacted by gun violence. It's been a lot of the work that I've done. And I kind of every year, I think I'm near the end of that coverage, and I just kind of keep going. So I'm still in the thick of that at the moment.
Was there much of a paradigm shift for you going from a local outlet to a globally recognized publisher, and how they operated, and what was that like?
The audience is very different. It's a big, broad audience. I mean, the fundamentals, I think, are the same. The things that I brought with me about, how to knock on a door, how to get somebody to talk to me, how to structure a story. And it was a much, much, much larger newsroom where you could sort of get lost in. I think it was more intense. It was a much more intense place. It is a more intense place. So I had to adjust to that a bit. But I think all those things were things that I really liked about the Post. It was also very collegial. I think sometimes people have this idea that places like the Post and the Times are these cutthroat environments, and that's never been my experience. It's always been a place where I felt very supported, and if I had questions, there were people who were always willing to answer.
That's great. So what happens after you find a story or subject that you want to cover, and just kind of walk us through what that's like in the newsroom and the process to getting your ideas greenlit?
Yeah, so it depends. I mean, sometimes ideas come from editors. Sometimes there are ideas. So I'll give you an example. I'll just walk you through a story that I did as because I don't feel like any two are kind of exactly the same. After the shooting in Uvalde, maybe 3.5 weeks after that shooting, I just flew to Uvalde. And I knew that I wanted to write a story about a survivor of the shooting there. And I had no context really when I went there. I just showed up. And, that's one thing, I think a privilege of working at the Post is they'll just send you somewhere without knowing if you're going to come back with a story or not. And I just showed up at a community meeting. They had a school board meeting, and I knew that I would just find people who would talk there. And I remember seeing this woman who had, she had a sweatshirt on it. It said "Fierce Madres." And she just looked like somebody who would know everyone and would be willing to maybe talk to me and engage with me a little bit. I always look at stories as, you want to find the gatekeepers. Like, there are always gatekeepers for every story. Like, sometimes you find those people through, maybe through the GoFundMe. Sometimes it's like a relative. Sometimes it's a teacher or a cousin or an uncle or an aunt. And I told her why I was there. Most of the reporters there at the time were reporting on the police response, which had been horrific. And I told them I was not there to cover that story. I was there to write about the impact on these kids in the community. And so she connected me with, she said, well, my ex-husband, his niece was killed, and do you want to meet him? And so I went over and talked to him, and he told me this story. This is all the first day of reporting there. He told me this story about how they went out to his niece's gravesite on her birthday. It would have been her 10th birthday. And her best friend was there. And while her best friend was there, this other dear friend of theirs who was still in the hospital called her. She said, well, where are you? And she said, well, we're at our friend's gravesite. And she said, well, can you put the phone on speaker? I want to sing her happy birthday. And I knew in that moment, I was like, well, this is the story, right? Like, this is the story. And that story evolved a bit. It really ultimately became mostly focused on the girl who was there and holding the phone. But that family, the family of the girl who died, they contacted this girl, and they said, sure, he can come over. And so I met them that night, and then I just basically lived in Uvalde for a summer, and just they let me just hang out a lot.
Wow, a whole summer.
Yeah, just about. I think I had 3 trips to Uvalde altogether that summer.
Yeah, so that's how long it kind of takes just for the preparation of getting into the story.
Often that is the way it is. Not always. Like, sometimes you don't have the luxury of that time. You have to speed things up. But one of my sort of journalism mantras is to always go and always stay. Because what you can get if you're there in person on the ground, it's very different than what you can get over the phone.
In 2021, HarperCollins published your book titled Children Under Fire, about the effects of gun violence on U.S. children. What kind of research and preparation do you do for such a delicate topic with such traumatic events?
So I had written about the subject by then for a couple of years. I started on this subject in 2017. I wrote a series for the Post then, and it was actually the first 2 kids that I met. First 2 stories I wrote for that series ended up becoming the central subjects of the book. A little girl in South Carolina who had survived a school shooting when she was in 1st grade. Her name is Ava Olson, and she'd been just on the playground when a 14-year-old showed up and opened fired. And he killed her best friend. And Ava survived, but dealt with a huge amount of trauma. Didn't go back to school for 6 years after that. And then the second kid I met and wrote about was a kid named Tyshawn. He lives in Southeast DC, or he did at the time. His father was killed in the middle of the day, and just outside of his school. It was close enough he could see the police lights from the lobby of his school. And those 2, through the course of my reporting, connected, and they became kind of each other's support. This girl in South Carolina and this boy in Southeast DC. And so they became kind of the central subjects of the story. It was helpful that I had written stories about them already, but I just kind of lived in their lives for a long time, and it was hard. It was hard reporting for sure.
Yeah.
But really gratifying. I'm still in close touch with both of those families. So.
That's wonderful to hear. So, is it challenging when you have to approach children who have gone through something so traumatic like a school shooting, and just how do you approach something like that, like a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it is really difficult. and there are so many factors at play. I mean, you have to. I've written stories about children as young as 4, and it's complicated. So I have a lot of techniques now and a lot of tips on how reporters should approach children who've suffered trauma of any kind, giving them agency, right? That's really the goal. And I think a lot of that can be true for interviewing traumatized adults too. But like when I meet a kid, whatever age they are, I explain to them exactly what I do. I will take out my phone and I'll show them stories that I've written before, not for them to read necessarily, but just to understand the idea. I ask permission if I can share their story with a broader audience. I do a lot of pre-reporting where I try to interview everyone around a kid before I interview the kid in case they have like triggers, if there's subjects that I shouldn't get into, if there's just areas that I should entirely avoid, or if there's stuff that I should engage with them on. I think that there is sometimes a mentality among reporters that we're adding to trauma. If you go about it the right way, I've never found that to be true. Most kids, most families that I approach, I am the only person who is interested in hearing their story, because even their family members are often too afraid to ask them anything. So I often find when I show up in people's lives, there's a desperation to share. And so with kids in particular, first thing I'll convey to them, and I repeatedly convey to them, is I am not an authority figure in their life. That every other adult might be, but I'm not. They're in charge, I'm not in charge. And that they're allowed to say no to anything I ask them. They can ignore my questions, they can take a break whenever they want to. And I keep telling them that. I want them to know that over and over, because they could look at me and say, well, you're just another adult. I have to answer the questions you ask. So I'll ask, like, especially with smaller kids, I'll ask them, where do you want to do the interview, right? And they'll usually want to, talk in their rooms because they want to show me their stuff, right? That's like the way in with a lot of kids, is like their stuff. So, when I'm physically doing the interview, like I'll try to get my eye level. Like I'll sit on the floor of kids' rooms. I'll ask the parents to stay nearby. I'll ask parents not to interrupt unless they think their kid really needs help, or if they see maybe they're having like a traumatic response. But, I want like the kid's eye level above mine, right? It's just a way to convey to them like that they're in charge and I'm not in charge. And, mostly what I ask kids is what happened next, right? That's it, is I'm just trying to take them back to, I'm never going to ask a kid, how do you feel? Because it's always okay. They're always fine. Like they're never going to be able to articulate really how they're feeling. But if you maybe take them back to a moment, have them walk you through it, that's a place where how they're feeling will just sort of organically emerge. A thing that I always ask now in any story I write about kids is I ask all the adults around them what questions the kids have been asking. That's a great way to understand a kid's anxieties, because they won't tell you, but they will ask. A good example, really where I learned that lesson was with Tyshawn. If you asked him ever how he was doing, he was always fine. I mean, I was with him on the morning of his dad's funeral, and he didn't wear it.
Yeah.
But he would ask his mom, why did my dad get shot? Did he have a gun when he got shot? Where's the person who killed him? Is that person going to come get me? Right? And it was a way for me to understand all of his anxieties. And I now always ask that question when I'm interviewing kids. But, it is a tricky thing. I also take their parents through these stories very, very, very carefully beforehand. It's mostly to fact check, but also because I owe them that. I mean, they've let me into the most sort of vulnerable space in their lives. They've let me have access to their children. And I think I never want anybody to be surprised by anything that's in the story. So even if they don't like it, they know it's coming, and they shouldn't be seeing it for the first time when it's on WashingtonPost.com.
Right, and how do you even go about like walking away from a family that you've had such a deep connection with, and then going back into it and talking to another family and just? Yeah,
that's hard. I mean, I find that I have to kind of to do the job. I can't typically I can't collect people. So, I'm always responsive. If somebody, I did a story on 8 years ago, if they text me, I'm always going to respond. But I have to let stories go before I can kind of take on the next one. There are exceptions, Ava and Ty, or their families I talk to a lot, the girl from Uvalde. But those are exceptions. Most of the kids I write about, I have to leave those stories behind. Once they've published, I have to not continue to follow up and check on people, just because I can't take that. It's just a burden that I can't really, I know myself now, and I have to just sort of move on to the next thing.
Your book was based on your 2017 reporting, which was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. A few years later, you went on to be a part of a team that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. So could you just tell us a bit about that work and how the team was able to produce this coverage?
The January 6th coverage, a huge team of reporters at the Post won the Pulitzer for Public Service, and I had been what's called the anchor for, that's like reporters will go out in the field and there's one person sort of sitting in front of their laptop and taking feeds from people. And I had been tapped to do that a few days before, and we had no idea what was going to happen that day. We had no sense of the significance of that news event, what was coming. So as it happened, I was in the back of a car with my laptop, thinking I was several hours away from needing to write anything, when the protesters breached the police line outside the Capitol. And I got a call from my editor who said, "You have 45 minutes to write a story that we have to publish." And I thought about just jumping out of the car, but didn't. And shortly after that, I got a call. I'm trying to stitch together all these feeds that are coming in, and I got a call immediately after that from a dear friend who I knew was on the ground there at the Capitol. I was a little bit annoyed actually that he was calling me because I was under this brutal deadline.
Right.
And I picked up the phone and I started to tell him, like, can you just call our editor? And he said, all I heard him say was someone's been shot. And then he lost service. And it was Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was killed. She'd been wheeled out in front of him and he basically saw her dying on the gurney. So it was, it was an incredibly intense day, and the Post, that story, the story that I wrote based on reporting from a lot of our colleagues, was entered part of that package. There were a lot of really good stories. We also did a profile of Ashley Babbitt. That was part of it, but the Post, basically everybody in that newsroom, I think, was involved in some way. But that day in particular was a really intense day.
I can't even imagine. You've also won countless awards for your reporting, including from Scripps, the Columbia Journalism School, and the Education Writers Association. What do these recognitions mean to you?
Especially for the institution and for the subjects that I'm writing about, it's really gratifying to see more attention brought to those. I try to always remember why I'm doing the work that I do, and for the bringing attention to these issues, bringing attention to these specific families and these kids. Gun violence is a tough subject to get people to read. So I'm always certainly gratified by the recognition, for sure.
So when writing, how much do you keep your audience in mind, as well as what you want them to take away from the piece?
Yeah, I'm very mindful of my audience. I think in 2024, if you're not as a journalist, then you're not going to be in the business for very long. I mean, we write stories that we know are not going to be widely read because they're really tough to read, maybe, or they're just on a subject that maybe people aren't going to engage on. And that's okay sometimes, right? Like, I think we can't just do stories that we know are going to get 1 million readers, because there's really important things that we need to write about that are hard for people to read. So, but I am still really mindful of the audience. I mean, one of the metrics that, everybody has metrics now, right, on how stories are doing. And we have a metric called engage time, and that's basically how long readers are staying on your stories. And that, for me, is the most important one. Is the higher that number, it just tells me that people are sticking with the story. And I try to write every story with the idea that the story won't completely make sense to somebody if they don't get to the end of it. I really start with the ending first when I'm writing. So, I try to be as efficient as I can try to keep the story moving, even though I write some very long stories and editors would probably disagree with that. But yeah, I'm always really thinking about the audience and keeping them engaged. Like, how do I keep that reader moving to the next section, to the next section, to the next section?
So can you speak to how investigative techniques are evolving in our data-rich world?
I think what data can do, and the way I've tried to use it throughout my career, is I write a lot of stories about specific people. There's that old journalism saying, go narrow, go deep, right? And I believe in that. Like, we should find individuals to tell broader stories through. But what data can do, especially for the kind of work I do, is it can tell the reader that this person is not unique, that they're not just the only person who's in the situation, that they represent all these other people. So a good example of that, the first school shooting that I wrote about in 2017, it was this little girl, Ava. One child died at that school. It's a school shooting no one remembers because there was only one death. And I went there 6 or 8 months after the shooting, and I just saw a school that was devastated, a community that was devastated. They had not gotten over it. And I was shocked, really, that this place that had gotten no attention was still wrestling with this to this degree, and these kids were clearly dealing with PTSD. So I naively thought at the time, well, I'm sure the government tracks school shootings, like surely they do, and of course they didn't.
Yeah.
So we created a database of school shootings going back to Columbine, but the real focus of that database was to figure out how many students had been on campus when a school shooting occurred. Because I wanted to say in that story, here are these, I wrote about 4 children there, and I wanted to say how many kids they represented. And that number now is nearing 400,000 in the 25 years since Columbine. And, so that's what data can do, right? It's not like just these 4 kids are dealing with this. It's in fact hundreds of thousands of kids who are dealing with this.
Do you have any advice for aspiring reporters and journalists that you want to give?
Yeah, there's always somebody who's more talented. Like there's always somebody with better connections. Really the thing that you get to decide is how hard you work. And that was the path to the job that I have now. I mean, it was a lot of really supportive people, but just deciding that I was going to work harder than the person next to me, right? And as the more competitive this business gets, which it does all the time, it gets more competitive all the time, that's a choice. Just choose to, if you want to do it, or if you wanted to be an enterprise reporter at the Washington Post, which isn't for everybody. You don't have to take that path, but if that's the path you want to go on, one of the choices you have to make is that I'm just going to outwork everybody else, and it gives you that chance to get there. So I would say that, and then I would say get to know like as many people as you can. Network, and be bold. Like journalists are good about responding because they like that. Like I like it when somebody emails me out of the blue and says, "Can I get advice from you?" Right? Like I will get back to people.
Those are great. Thank you so much. And thank you to our viewers for joining us. Until next time, good night.